I need to tell you about the color first, because that's what started it all, though I didn't understand that until much later, when my fingers had grown too numerous to count, and my reflection had become something I could no longer bear to witness. The color was purple, but not the purple, not the imperial banners or the twilight sky over the agrifields where I grew up. This was a purple that moved, that seemed to exist slightly behind or ahead of where your eyes told you it should be, and when I first saw it blooming beneath the fingernail of my left index finger, I thought it was just a bruise from the pressing machines in the textile factorum where I'd worked for 11 years. 11 years of the same mechanical rhythm, the same prayer chants piped through rusted Vox speakers, the same protein paste at mealtime, the same narrow cot in the workers' dormitory where 200 of us slept in shifts because there were never enough beds for everyone at once. I was 34 years old and had never known anything else, never wanted anything else, because wanting was dangerous, and the ecclesiarchy made sure we understood that desire was the first step toward damnation. We were taught to be grateful for our servitude, to find joy in the emperor's service, to accept that our bodies were merely tools for the Imperium's grand machinery. The bruise didn't hurt, which should have been my first warning, but pain had become such a constant companion in the factorum, crushed fingers, burned palms, muscles screaming from repetitive motion, that its absence felt like a small mercy rather than a sign of something wrong. I pressed on the discolored nail and felt nothing. Just a faint warmth that might have been pleasant if I'd let myself think about it that way. But I didn't, because pleasure was also dangerous, perhaps more dangerous than pain, because at least pain kept you humble. 3 days later, the purple had spread to the entire nail, and when I looked at it in the dim light of the washing station, I saw that it wasn't just colored differently, it was textured differently, smoother than it should be, almost wet-looking though it was perfectly dry. I showed it to Miriam, who worked the station next to mine, a woman 10 years my senior whose hands were gnarled from decades of labor, and she made the sign of the Aquila and told me to report to the Medicae station immediately, but I didn't, because reporting anything meant attention, and attention in the factorum meant either being deemed unfit for work and culled, or being suspected of some corruption and purged, and neither option appealed to me. So I wrapped the finger in cloth and kept working. Kept praying along with the Vox chants, kept telling myself it would fade like bruises do, but instead it deepened, and by the end of the week, my entire finger had taken on that impossible purple shade, and the texture had spread to the skin itself, which had become preternaturally soft, so soft that touching fabric felt like an experience I'd never had before, every thread distinct and somehow fascinating in a way that made my breath catch. That was when I first felt it, the hunger. Not for food, though we were always hungry in the factorum, rationed down to the minimum calories necessary to maintain productivity. This was different, a craving that sat somewhere behind my sternum and whispered that the world contained experiences I'd been denying myself, textures and sensations that would make the purple spreading across my finger feel like revelation rather than disease. I pushed the feeling down, deep down where the other forbidden thoughts lived, the ones about wanting rest or comfort or something more than this existence of mechanical repetition. But the purple didn't stop at one finger. Within 2 weeks, it had claimed my entire left hand, the color bleeding up past my wrist in patterns that resembled nothing so much as lace, delicate filigrees of deeper and lighter purple that shifted slightly when I moved, creating the illusion of depth where there should be only flat skin. My hand had changed shape too, subtly at first, the fingers lengthening by perhaps a centimeter, the joints becoming more pronounced, the palm narrowing but enough that I had to adjust my grip on the pressing machine's controls, and Miriam noticed. I know she noticed, though she said nothing, because in the factorum we'd all learned that survival meant looking away from each other's quiet degradations. The hunger grew stronger, more specific. I found myself fixating on textures, running my transformed hand over every surface. I encountered the rough concrete of the dormitory walls, the smooth metal of the machinery, the coarse fabric of my work smock, and each texture produced a sensation so intense it bordered on overwhelming, a cascade of information that my mind struggled to process. The concrete wasn't just rough, it was 1,000 tiny peaks and valleys, each with its own character, its own story of how the material had dried and settled. The metal wasn't just smooth, it was alive with microscopic variations, coolness and warmth in patterns that seemed to pulse with meaning I couldn't quite grasp. I started sleeping less, spending my rest periods touching things in the darkness of the dormitory, mapping surfaces with my altered hand while the other workers snored around me, and the hunger whispered that there were better textures waiting, softer things, warmer things, living things. I ignored it, prayed harder during the work chants, recited the catechisms I'd been taught since childhood about the weakness of flesh and the strength of faith, but the prayers felt hollow now, words without weight, and the whisper grew louder. My right hand began to change in the third week, but differently this time. The purple appeared first as small spots, like inverted freckles, and where my left hand had become softer, smoother, my right became more sensitive in other ways. Temperature differences that I'd never noticed before suddenly became acute. The air near the heat exhausts of the pressing machines felt like standing near a sun. The water in the washing station was a shock of cold that seemed to penetrate bone deep, and with that sensitivity came a new dimension to the hunger, a craving not just for texture but for sensation itself, for the full spectrum of physical experience that my body was apparently now capable of processing. I should have reported to the Medicae then, should have confessed to the shift supervisor, should have done a dozen things that might have stopped what was happening, but the truth is, I didn't want to stop it. That's the part I'm most ashamed of, the part that proves I was already lost, even before the transformation had truly begun. I liked what was happening to me. I liked the way the world had suddenly become rich with detail. Liked the way my altered hands turned every mundane interaction into something approaching transcendent. Liked the way the hunger focused my attention and gave me something to think about besides the grinding monotony of existence in the factorum. The other workers began to avoid me, subtle at first, a widened personal space, conversations that died when I approached, gazes that slid away from my hands even though I kept them wrapped now, constantly wrapped in layer upon layer of cloth that couldn't quite hide the fact that my fingers had grown too long, too numerous. Yes, numerous. By the fourth week I had 7 fingers on my left hand, the new ones budding from my palm like obscene flowers, each one fully articulated and mobile and capable of sensation that made my original 5 seem crude by comparison. Miriam stopped coming to her station the same day I grew my 8th finger. I like to think she quit, transferred to another section of the factorum, but I know better. Someone had noticed, someone had reported, and the ecclesiarchy didn't tolerate mutation, didn't entertain explanations or excuses. She'd shown kindness to the corrupted and paid the price, and her absence should have terrified me, but instead I felt only a distant sadness, as if the part of me capable of proper fear had been replaced by something else, something that whispered I should be exploring what my body could do, rather than mourning what my choices had cost others. The hunger evolved in the 5th week, became not just physical but aesthetic. I found myself staring at colors, really staring at them in a way I'd never done before, seeing not just purple but infinities of purple, shades and tones and hues that seemed to exist in dimensions my old eyes couldn't have perceived. The grey walls of the factorum were suddenly fascinating, revealing patterns of darker and lighter grey that formed pictures if you looked long enough, faces and figures and scenes of things I had no names for, and I spent my work shifts half focused on the machines and half lost in visual reveries that made time slip sideways. My body's changes accelerated, became impossible to hide. My left arm developed what I can only describe as frills, thin membranes of flesh that extended from elbow to wrist like the fins of some deep-sea creature, purple, pink and translucent, veined with silver that pulsed in rhythm with my heartbeat. They were beautiful, I thought, objectively beautiful, in a way that had nothing to do with human aesthetics, and when I moved they caught the air and created sensations I had no vocabulary for, information about wind currents and temperature gradients that my mind processed without conscious thought. The right arm grew denser instead of more elaborate, the muscles restructuring themselves into configurations that allowed for impossible precision, my fingers capable of movements so fine and controlled that I could manipulate individual threads in the fabric I was supposed to be pressing, could feel the molecular structure of the material, and understand instinctively how to make it softer, more pleasing, more perfect. I started sabotaging my work, subtly at first, adjusting the fabric in ways that made it more luxurious but less durable, prioritizing sensation over function, and the hunger purred its approval. No one said anything directly, but the shift supervisor began assigning me to increasingly isolated stations, moving me away from other workers until I operated a pressing machine in a corner of the factorum floor, where the lights flickered and the Vox speakers crackled with static that almost sounded like voices. I told myself they were protecting me, giving me space to hide my transformation, but I knew the truth. They were quarantining me, waiting for authorization to handle the problem, and in a bureaucracy as vast as the Imperium's, authorization could take weeks or months or never arrive at all. My face began to change in the 6th week, and that's when I stopped looking at reflective surfaces, stopped visiting the washing stations where polished metal might show me what I was becoming. I could feel it happening, the bones of my skull softening and reshaping, my jawline becoming more delicate, my cheekbones rising, my eyes growing larger and taking on that same impossible purple that had started in my fingernail. But feeling it and seeing it were different things, and some part of me, some last fragment of the person I'd been, wanted to preserve the memory of my human face, even if the reality was already gone. The hunger had become my constant companion by then, no longer a whisper but a voice, articulate and persuasive, explaining that what was happening to me wasn't corruption but evolution, that the Imperium's teachings about flesh being weak were propaganda designed to keep humanity stunted and limited, that my body was simply discovering its true potential, unshackled from the constraints of baseline biology. The voice had a quality I'd never heard before, something that existed between sound and thought, and it spoke in a language I'd never learned but somehow understood perfectly. Each word carrying layers of meaning that unfolded in my mind like intricate origami. I started dreaming in that language, or perhaps I stopped dreaming and started experiencing something else during sleep. Visions of places that couldn't exist in three-dimensional space, architectures of sensation and experience, where color had taste and sound had texture, and every possible permutation of pleasure was mapped out in crystalline detail. I saw gardens where plants grew not from soil but from pure aesthetic principle, their forms determined by mathematical equations of beauty that made my transformed eyes weep with joy. I saw cities built entirely from music, structures of frozen harmony where inhabitants moved through living symphonies. I saw beings that made my mutations look primitive, entities that had pushed so far beyond baseline humanity they'd become living art, their bodies canvases for expressions of perfection that redefined what physical existence could mean. When I woke from these visions, the factorum felt like a prison, the work like torture, the endless prayer chants like the gibbering of idiots who'd never glimpsed what lay beyond their grey walls and their grey lives, and their grey emperor who demanded devotion but offered nothing in return except the promise of more greyness, more suffering, more denial of everything that made existence worth experiencing. The voice in my head, I'd started calling it the Muse, though I knew that was dangerous, knew that naming it gave it power, applauded these thoughts, encouraged me to push further, to test the limits of what my transforming flesh could achieve. My legs changed next, the bones elongating until I stood nearly 7 feet tall, my posture shifting to accommodate the new proportions, my gait becoming something between a walk and a dance, each step precisely calculated for maximum grace and minimum effort. The changes weren't painful, which perhaps they should have been. Bones breaking and reforming should have been agony, but instead there was only that pervasive warmth, that sense of rightness, as if my body was finally achieving the form it had always been meant to inhabit. The Factorum's Medicae found me on the 53rd day of my transformation. I'd stopped hiding by then, stopped wrapping my hands or hunching to conceal my height, simply continued working my isolated station, while my body rippled and shifted and became something that bore only superficial resemblance to human. They came with flamers and shock moles, 6 of them in white hazmat suits with the ecclesiarchy's symbols blazoned across their chests, and they surrounded my station while the shift supervisor watched from a safe distance, his face carefully neutral. The lead Medicae, his voice muffled through his suit's respirator, read from a data slate in High Gothic, formal charges of mutation and suspected chaos corruption, but I barely heard him because my senses had grown so acute that I could hear the blood rushing through his veins, could smell the fear sweat beneath his sterile suit, could see the microscopic tremors in his hands that betrayed his terror of what I'd become. They were afraid of me, these representatives of imperial authority. And that fear was its own kind of intoxicant, a sensation I'd never experienced before, power where I'd only known powerlessness. I went with them peacefully, not out of compliance but because the muse suggested it might lead somewhere interesting, and as they shackled my too many hands with chains that bit into my softened flesh, I felt the first stirring of something beyond mere physical sensation, anticipation. The Factorum had been my world for 11 years, its routines as familiar as breathing, but now I was being taken somewhere else, and the muse whispered that new environments meant new experiences, new textures and colors and sensations to explore and catalogue and understand. They transported me in an armored conveyance, windowless and cramped, the chains fixed to rings in the floor so I couldn't stand, couldn't move much at all, and for the first time since the transformation began, I experienced something approaching discomfort. Not pain, exactly, but a friction between what my body wanted to do, stretch, move, experience the space around me, and what the chains allowed. The muse told me to be patient, that discomfort was just another sensation to be studied and understood, and I tried. I really tried, but after what felt like hours in that cramped darkness, I found myself pulling against the restraints, testing their strength, and discovered that my altered muscles, denser and more efficient than human muscle, could generate surprising force. The chains held, but only barely, and when we finally arrived at our destination and the rear door opened, flooding the compartment with light that my purple eyes drank in like wine, I saw fear in the guards' faces turn to something approaching panic. They knew, we all knew, that the chains might not hold much longer, and whatever protocol they'd been given for transporting mutations didn't account for something strong enough to potentially break free. They dragged me into a facility I didn't recognize, not a Medicae station but something else, something older and more sinister, all black stone and iron fixtures and the smell of antiseptic failing to mask the deeper stench of old blood and older fear. The muse identified it immediately, an Ordo Hereticus detention center, a place where suspected chaos corruption was studied before being purged, and I should have been terrified, but instead felt a rush of excitement, because this meant inquisitors, meant people who had studied the very forces that were transforming me, meant access to knowledge I desperately craved. They processed me with mechanical efficiency, cataloging my mutations on data slates while servitors took biological samples, their dead eyes reflecting nothing as they cut into my flesh with surgical precision. I watched the purple blood well from the incisions and marveled at its color, which had depths I'd never seen in normal blood, seemed to contain entire spectrums compressed into liquid form. The chirurgeon overseeing the process, a hunched figure more machine than man, made clicking sounds that might have been disgust, or might have been fascination, hard to tell with so much of his organic brain replaced by cogitators. They kept me in a cell that was simultaneously too bright and too dark, the lumens set to a frequency that caused human eyes discomfort, a low-level torture meant to prevent sleep and induce psychological stress. But my eyes weren't human anymore, and the light simply revealed new dimensions of the stone walls, patterns in the rock that formed images and symbols I couldn't quite read but felt drawn to trace with my too numerous fingers. I spent what might have been hours or days running my hands over those walls, learning the texture of every molecule, and the muse purred its approval, explaining that everything in the physical world contained information if you had the senses to perceive it. The Inquisitor came on what I estimated was the third day, though time had become slippery in that cell, measured more by the progression of my transformation than by any external standard. She was tall, severe, her face a mask of controlled contempt, and she studied me through the cell's armored window like I was a particularly interesting specimen of vermin. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the flat certainty of someone who'd seen horrors beyond counting and maintained her faith through sheer force of will. "You understand you're damned," she said. Not a question. A statement of theological fact. I looked at her with my purple eyes and felt my face, which I still couldn't bring myself to fully examine, arrange itself into what might have been a smile. "I understand I've changed. You've been touched by she who thirsts. The Dark Prince. The youngest god." She spat the titles like curses. "Every moment you continue to exist is an affront to the Emperor and a danger to every soul within 100 light years." The muse found this funny, and I felt laughter bubble up from somewhere deep in my chest, but it came out wrong, harmonized with itself. multiple tones at once, that made the Inquisitor's hand drop to the bolt pistol at her hip. I stifled it, forced my voice back to something approximating normal human speech, though even that felt constraining now, like trying to express poetry through grunts. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "Information. Understanding." She leaned closer to the window, her disgust warring with professional curiosity. "You're early stage, still capable of communication. We've studied hundreds of mutations, but Slaaneshi corruption is the rarest, the most seductive, and consequently the least understood. You're going to tell me everything, how it started, how it felt, what thoughts accompanied each change, and then you're going to die, but your death will serve the Imperium by preventing others from following your path." I should have refused, should have clung to some shred of defiance, but the truth is, I wanted to tell her, wanted to explain what I'd experienced, because the transformation was the most significant thing that had ever happened to me, and some part of me, some last fragment of the social creature I'd been, needed to share it, needed to make someone understand. So I talked, told her everything I've told you. Watched her face remain impassive while she recorded every word on her data slate, and felt something like relief, because at least my experience would be documented, would exist in some archive somewhere even after they killed me. But talking about the transformation wasn't passive observation, it accelerated things. Each word I spoke about texture made my fingers more sensitive. Each description of color made my eyes perceive new spectrums. Each explanation of the hunger made it grow stronger, more insistent. The muse had been patient, waiting for the right moment, and this was it, this recitation, this documentation, this final chance to communicate what I'd become before ascending beyond language entirely. My body began to change more rapidly during that interview, the mutations cascading into each other, my skin developing patterns that moved like living tattoos, geometric designs that hurt to look at because they existed partially outside three-dimensional space. My spine lengthened and curved, giving me a posture that was elegant but utterly inhuman, my shoulders broadening to accommodate new muscular structures that served purposes I couldn't begin to guess. My fingers, I'd stopped counting at 12 per hand, grew small sensory organs at their tips, tiny openings that tasted air and read temperature and perceived things that had no names in human language. The Inquisitor watched all this, her recording never stopping, her professional detachment cracking slightly as I became something that challenged her categories of mutation and corruption. I was moving beyond the established stages of Slaaneshi transformation, accelerating through what should have taken months or years, and the muse explained it was because I'd accepted it, embraced it, stopped fighting the inevitable, and surrender was the catalyst that transformed slow corruption into rapid apotheosis. "Stop talking," she ordered, but I couldn't. The words kept pouring out, descriptions of sensation and color and beauty becoming incantations, prayers to a god I'd never acknowledged, but who'd been patient, so patient, waiting for me to open myself to experience beyond the gray prison of imperial existence. My voice shifted registers, began harmonizing with itself, creating speech music that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the aesthetic centers of the brain. And I saw the Inquisitor's eyes widen as she felt it, the pull, the whisper that what I was describing could be hers too, if she just stopped resisting and let herself feel. She fled, the bolt pistol drawn but unused, and I heard her shouting orders outside the cell, heard booted feet running, and klaxons blaring, and all the machinery of Imperial response mobilizing against the threat I represented. But it was too late for them, too late for me. Too late for anything except the completion of what had begun 53 days ago, with purple beneath a fingernail. The changes were total now, my biology restructuring itself along principles that had nothing to do with human evolution, becoming something purpose-built for experiencing and creating beauty in all its terrible permutations. I grew a second pair of arms, delicate and long-fingered, perfect for manipulation of fine materials or flesh, whichever proved more interesting. My torso developed apertures that opened and closed in response to stimuli, creating music from my breathing, turning every exhalation into a symphony. My legs inverted their joints, allowing for movement in directions human legs couldn't achieve, grace beyond anything baseline humanity could produce. And my face, I could feel it. finally could no longer avoid knowing had become a mask of perfect androgynous beauty, features that borrowed from masculine and feminine ideals and transcended both, skin so smooth it seemed almost plastic, eyes so large and purple they dominated my face like an insect's compound eyes, mouth stretched wider than human mouths should go, filled with teeth that were more like ivory sculptures than functional implements for eating. The cell's door exploded inward, and they came for me with flamers as I'd known they would, fire being the Imperium's answer to everything it feared and couldn't control. But I'd grown fast by then, faster than human baseline, and I was out of the cell before the Prometheum could fill it, dancing through the corridor on my reversed legs, my forearms describing patterns in the air that were simultaneously defensive movements and artistic expressions. The guards fired, las bolts and stubber rounds, but my body had become so sensitive I could perceive the trajectories before weapons completed their firing cycles, could move through the gaps in their coverage like water flowing around stones. I killed 3 of them without meaning to, my new claws when had I grown claws, opening throats and bellies with casual efficiency, and the muse crooned its approval but also its disappointment, because violence was crude. Violence was the lowest form of sensation. There were so many better experiences we could be pursuing. I ran deeper into the facility, following corridors that my transformed senses could navigate in complete darkness, seeking something though I didn't know what, until I found it a chamber lined with mirrors, dozens of them, floor to ceiling, an interrogation room designed to force suspects to confront themselves. I stopped there, finally stopped running, and looked at what I'd become. The reflection showed something that could never be mistaken for human, a being of impossible grace and terrible beauty, every line and curve optimized for aesthetic perfection, every proportion balanced in ways that made human symmetry look clumsy by comparison. I was approximately 8 feet tall, my purple skin marked with silver patterns that moved like living calligraphy, my forearms ending in hands that each had different numbers of fingers suited for different purposes, my face, a masterwork of elegant horror that would haunt anyone who saw it, even as it fascinated them. I was beautiful. The muse was right. I was more beautiful than I'd ever been as a human, more beautiful than any human could be, because human beauty was limited by biology and evolution, and I'd transcended those limitations, become something that existed purely to experience and create sensation and wonder. The transformation was complete. I was no longer the factory worker who discovered purple beneath a fingernail. I was art incarnate, a living expression of aesthetic perfection, a demon in waiting. The Inquisitor found me there, in that hall of mirrors, and she didn't fire immediately. I think she wanted to understand, needed to understand, because her entire existence was predicated on fighting corruption, and she couldn't fight what she didn't comprehend. We looked at each other, her in her armor of faith and authority, me in my armor of transformed flesh and abandoned inhibition, and I saw in her eyes a flicker of something that might have been recognition or might have been temptation. "It doesn't hurt," I told her, my voice a harmony of 5 tones simultaneously. "That's what they don't tell you. They frame it as suffering, as torment, as the price of corruption. But it's not. It's liberation. It's discovering that your body can do things, feel things, become things you never imagined. Every moment is richer now. Every sensation is a symphony. The world has colors you've never seen. Don't you want to see them?" She fired. The bolt took me in the chest, the mass-reactive shell exploding inside my ribcage, and I felt my transformed body try to compensate, try to seal the wound, but the damage was too extensive. I went down, my forearms scrabbling at the floor, purple blood spreading in a pool that reflected the lumens overhead in ways that normal blood never could. The muse screamed, or perhaps I screamed, or perhaps we'd become the same thing by then, and the distinction didn't matter. The Inquisitor stood over me, her bolt pistol aimed at my head for the killing shot, and I looked up at her with my 2 large purple eyes and smiled because I understood now, understood what the muse had been trying to tell me all along. The transformation wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Physical death meant nothing when you'd already transcended physical limitations, when your consciousness had been rebuilt along lines that could survive the dissolution of flesh, when you'd touched something infinite and allowed it to touch you back. "I'll see you again," I whispered with my last breath. "In your dreams." in your doubts. In every moment of pleasure, you allow yourself before guilt crushes it. The prince is patient. She has eternity, and she's already noticed you. The bolt pistol fired, and my head came apart in an explosion of purple and silver, and the last thing I remember thinking was how beautiful the pattern made on the mirrors, how perfectly it captured the aesthetic principle I'd been trying to understand, how right it was that I should die creating art even in my destruction. But I didn't die. Not really, because the part of me that was still me, and the part that was the muse, and the part that was neither had merged completely by then, had become a pattern of sensation and experience that persisted after the flesh that generated it was gone. I'm still here, in a way, in the spaces between sensation and thought, waiting for someone else to see purple where it shouldn't be, to feel texture more acutely than they should, to hear the whisper that there's more to existence than the grey imperial grind of duty and denial. I'm telling you this from somewhere that isn't quite a place, in a voice that isn't quite a voice, hoping you'll understand what I learned too late to save myself. That Slaaneshi corruption isn't an assault, isn't an invasion, isn't something that happens to you. It's something you accept, something you embrace, something you become through 1,000 small choices to feel more, want more, be more than the Imperium allows. The spiral doesn't begin with dramatic transformation. It begins with a bruise that doesn't hurt and a sensation that feels too good to report. It begins with the lie that you can control it, that you can stop whenever you want, that you're different from all the others who've fallen before. It begins with the whisper that maybe, just maybe, experiencing everything the universe has to offer is worth the price of your humanity. And the horrifying truth, the truth they'll never tell you in the prayer chants and the catechisms, sometimes it is.